Hello, everyone. It's great to be back on stage. That was a phenomenal panel. So thank you so much to all of our panelists for sharing their expertise. I am delighted to introduce the next session, which is our first keynote of the day. And it's a conversation between two women that I admire so much. And I wanted to take a minute to introduce them before bringing them up on stage. So the first is Joanna Coles. Joanna, for those of you who do not know her, is a creative executive, a producer, a best-selling author. She manages a portfolio of TV and podcast projects with ABC, Amazon, and Apple. She sits on not one, not two, but 3 public boards: Sonos, Bark, and Snap, known to most of you as Snapchat. Joanna also advises Masterclass, Klarna, a private equity company known as Cornell Capital, and she is the executive producer of Hulu's show, The Bold Type, which you can see on Netflix globally. It is a 5-season TV drama inspired by her career. If you haven't watched it, it's a lot of fun. I would recommend you check it out. Before all of this, Joanna was the chief content officer of Hearst magazines, responsible for over 300 magazines globally. She was previously the editor-in-chief of Cosmo, or Cosmopolitan magazine, which I'm sure we're all familiar with. Before that, earlier in her career, she has been the New York bureau chief for The Guardian, the New York bureau chief for The Times of London. Essentially, if there is an important media role or property, Joanna has probably been there. She also is an author. She wrote a book called Love Rules. She was the on-air mentor for Project Runway All Stars. She executive produced an unscripted series called So Cosmo on E! Back in 2017. And she advises a nonprofit, Women Entrepreneurs New York City, an initiative to expand female entrepreneurship with a focus on underserved women and communities. She was recently described, as probably no surprise given that intro, she was recently described by the New York Times as one of the most powerful people in media. And Joanna is going to be in conversation today with Nayeema Raza. So Nayeema is a journalist at New York Magazine. She's also an executive producer and co-host of the podcast On with Swisher. Nayeema has had an incredible career that has spanned international policy reform in Libya, making documentary films and TV that has premiered at Tribeca and Telluride. She also has been a print, audio, and video journalist at the New York Times. I met Nayeema 2 years ago as the world was starting to come out sort of after COVID, and I was blown away by her. In addition, I became aware that Nayeema has a cult following after I posted a photo of the two of us on Instagram, and numerous women that I know were like, "You know Nayeema Raza?" So yes, I am so honored and excited to have two women that I know, respect, and admire in conversation together for our Inspiration Summit. I could not imagine a more fun matchup than Nayeema and Joanna, and I'm excited for the conversation that's in store for all of you. So without further ado, Nayeema, I will turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Catherine, for having us. And thank you to everyone at the Muse and the Fairy God Boss communities for having us today. I am thrilled to be in conversation with the one and only Joanna Coles. She's a legend in my business and media, but she's a legend in business overall, and someone who I've come to know a bit in recent years, who's always been encouraging and I think very supportive, has earned a reputation of being very supportive of women. I'm even more thrilled because when we're chatting about what we might talk about today, I had a few kind of diplomatic openings, and Joanna just jumped in and said, well, actually, Joanna, what you said something like, I want to talk about why people aren't having kids, what's happening in the world right now, and this idea of career and family trade-off. But I'll let you say it in your own words.
Well, thank you, Catherine, for that ridiculously long introduction. And all I think that means is that I'm just fantastically old at this point. And Nayeema, great to be able to talk to you. And what I think is fun about having these conversations with the Muse, and I really would love to hear from people. So I know there's a chat function on this. Do send your questions in. One of the complicating things, I think, for women is this lack of encouragement around having children. And I am really struck by the statistics that, 20 years ago, it was 1 in 10 women not having children. It's now 1 in 5, which is really statistically significant. And I feel that as a culture, we don't remind women that having children can be really fun and is, I think, one of the great joys of life that we really have forgotten how to talk about. And I really want.
Hi, I think that we've just had just a moment. Just had a freeze.
I'm back. Great. I think someone on the web didn't like what I was saying. But I really worry that we don't have an encouraging conversation about having children with women. And I don't think we're always realistic about the timeline either for women to do this. And it's an unfair biological fact that, you know, women do have a clock. Men actually have a clock too, but right. Women have a slightly more, have a shorter clock. And it's really, you can tell this is live because the phone is going, the doorbell is going, oh, the doorbell's going again. So it was something I wanted to talk to you about, and it was something I wanted to hear from the Muse users or subscribers about, because I think it's really important. And I know, I was talking to a young woman the other day who told me that she decided to put having children aside because she really wanted to focus on her career. And when I asked her what her career was, she was in sales for a social media company. And I just thought, why on earth would you put your life on hold, something really significant for that particular job? And of course, she was proud of her job. She worked hard to get it. I'm not demeaning that in any way. But I do think one wants to step back a little bit. And we've created these enormous conversations about women's careers, as we should do, and the systemic reasons for why women have found it hard traditionally to rise in corporate America, all of which is utterly justified. But we've slightly stopped having conversations about what is it that creates a powerful life? What is it that creates a meaningful life? And in the end, loyalty to a company, the company is never going to be as loyal to you as you will be to it. Hopefully you work for lots of companies throughout your life, or you'll start lots of things throughout your life. But I would hate younger women to miss out on the opportunity of having children, because it's complicated and difficult and expensive, but it's also fabulous and life affirming.
I'm really excited to talk about this with you and with this community, because I think this is a conversation that you hear on Tucker Carlson, on Joe Rogan. You hear Scott Galloway talking about why there aren't enough babies and women aren't having children. I think and it's a really important conversation to have interculturally. I think that it would be helpful maybe to start with, Joanna, your own experience here. And yes, people, if you have questions, please drop them in the chat as we go. But maybe talk about your own life here, Joanna, because you're someone who I see has, you know, you're one of these women who's kind of heralded, whether you want to be or not, as kind of having it all. And, you know, I've had the pleasure of meeting one of your sons, and you have written about that process of, you know, building a family. That's been a book that you had written. So I'm curious, talk about how your career, you made the decision around career and personal life and ambition as not just being a career ambition. And what, my big question for you is, what do you regret? What would you have done differently?
Well, I'm always hesitant. I'm just turning the volume up a bit. I'm always hesitant to use my own life as any kind of template for anybody else, because you make the decisions you do. And I'm very glad that I made the decision to move to America from the UK. You can probably tell I'm not a native New Yorker. But not everybody wants to do that. And there are certain sacrifices that come with that, not least your friends and your family, and having to make much more effort to stay in touch with that. And I'm very sympathetic to immigrants. I am an immigrant, and you really do tear at the fabric of your life in a way you don't always understand until you've actually moved. That said, it's always interesting to hear people describe you. And when I think about my life, the first thing I think about my life is my two sons. Because they're the most important things. They're the things that have taken the most energy. They're the things they're the people that I look to for, you know, advice, encouragement, reassurance. I want to check in on them, but I want them to check in on me. They very rarely do that, because they're young adult males and they're fairly self-absorbed at the moment.
That's because you're not yet fabulously old, Joanna. They will start checking in more.
I certainly can feel like that. But but families and friendships
Mhm.
don't get talked about enough, I think, in our conversations about our jobs and our careers, and they're an incredibly important part of a proper life.
I think we just had a momentary delay. Hopefully Joanna will be back with us in just a moment.
Yep, here I am again. And, you know, the people that you choose to have children with, the people you choose to be your friends, are going to be just as important as the career you choose to pursue or the work you choose to do. And yet we really don't talk about it enough. And so as I go into my next sort of act, I really want people to have bolder conversations about the kind of life they want and what constitutes a meaningful life, because it's not just work, and it's very hard to sometimes bear that in mind in America because it's an expensive place to live. It's very much a sort of still an individualistic pioneering culture, and these are conversations that I think other cultures don't necessarily worry about in the same way that we do.
Yes, I mean, I grew up in Asia and Africa. I'm Pakistani, and so I certainly find this conversation is a more Western conversation, but it was also a generational conversation. It's a conversation. You know, in South Korea, the average age of a first-time mother is actually higher than even in the United States or in places like New York City. So it is also happening globally. You avoided my question though, Joanna. What is when you look back, is there anything you regret, something you had done more of, or?
Well, I guess the only thing I really regret is that I wish I had moved to America much earlier in my career. I moved here in my mid-30s, and I wish in retrospect that I had just moved here after college, actually.
Right.
But I don't think I would have been set up probably to do it. I've just enjoyed living in America so much, and there's so much opportunity. And so in many ways, I look back and think, God, what was I doing for the first 15 years of my career?
You're doing great journalism in London, but I understand.
Yeah, I love journalism in England, and I love, you know, I love the group of friends I've got. My best friends are still very much in the UK, but I do wish that I had moved here earlier. And I think, you know, perhaps I just wasn't brave enough, actually.
Yeah. And sometimes I think we defer. It's easy to look backwards and say, oh, I wish I had done this sooner. But sometimes you need that path to get you to where you are. And I think, speaking of this idea of deferring or delaying, the idea of women delaying childbirth or being mother. So in 1972, the average age of a first-time mother was 21. This is obviously before Roe versus Wade. So there's also all kinds of policy implications at stake. But by 2018, it was 26, and now the average age in the US is up to 30. And it's higher yet in places like New York or San Francisco, higher in places like Spain or South Korea. I think there's this kind of, I speak with a lot of friends. I'm in my late 30s. I haven't had a kid yet. So I speak to friends about what's the right way to do it. Should you have kids young, delay starting your career, or should you start your career and then have a bit of a donut? I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, because that's how choice is kind of presented to us. And maybe that's even a false dichotomy.
Right. Because the choice is presented to us like that, as if we actually had any control over it. Right. And a lot of it's to do with, have you met someone that you want to have children with? Because that's clearly the key issue. We also need to talk about money, which is again something that
we're going to talk about both those things.
Right. Really complicated to talk about money. And but I do think we've set up, women are great perfectionists, and we've sort of set up this idea that we have to be the perfect parent, that you have to have, you know, a hand woven cradle from the organic farms in Vermont to have your child. And if you don't have that, it's all going to be a disaster. And obviously that's not true. I mean, the British author Martin Amis talks about being put in a drawer when he was born, you know, that his parents, one of whom was a writer, I think his mum was a homemaker, just literally put him in a drawer. Obviously they didn't close it, but they had him sleep in a drawer when he was a baby because that's what was available. And now we have this nightmare sort of meta world reflected back to us from Instagram and TikTok of what the perfect parent and the perfect nursery is supposed to look like. And it's very hard to to sort of acknowledge that your life will never look like that, and that, you know, you may have a drawer for the baby, but actually the baby may still grow up to be a fantastically valuable human being, and you don't need all the consumer goods around a child that we're taught that we do.
Right. And I think that something is happening that's very interesting right now, because there's two kind of trends. One is there's this empowerment of choice. So we're moving from conversations around childlessness to powerful language. Like, I'm child free. I was kind of scrolling through a Reddit subthread called child free. There's also at the same time shame of wanting the thing that's not cool anymore. It's shameful in some way to say, well, I want to be an independent woman. I want to have a career, but I also really want those things. I really want to meet a partner. I really want to have a kid, you know?
Yeah,
And
I think that's a very, very good observation, Nayeema, as usual from you. There is shame, I think, around people saying, I want to be part of a family.
right.
And somehow family has become this sort of negative in our culture, and being married has become sort of negative. And yet, if they work, and I'm not pretending every family is marvelous, I'm not pretending every marriage is marvelous, and I'm not saying that every woman should have children, of course not, but I do think we've created this narrative in the culture where it appears too difficult to do that. And I would urge people, if they have any ambiguity at all about it, to be honest about that, because it's a wonderful thing to have a family, and it's a wonderful thing to have children. It's very sustaining, and it connects you to a much wider part of the world than just work or just a career.
I think what about this idea that children can trap you? This is leaning into the negative narrative, but there's this sense that children can trap you in a dead-end career, that you need to financially support them in a relationship that you don't want to necessarily be in for 18 plus years, in a suburb rather than the city you want to live in. How, you know, right now we live in a time where people are seeking more flexibility than ever before. Catherine shared some data with me from the Muse saying that Gen Z, 80% of Gen Z employees have said it's acceptable to leave a job within 6 months. There's more career switching than ever before. So how do you have kids and preserve flexibility or autonomy?
Well, actually, what I think is most exciting coming out of COVID is the new flexibility in the workplace. So I look back when I was running, say, Cosmo, or when I was running Marie Claire, and I was responsible for a team of people, and we had a lot of young mothers on the staff. And I wish I had said to them, you know, Mondays and Fridays, you can work from home. It would have made their lives so much easier. For certain people that I really trusted, I let them do Fridays from home. But I knew myself how stressful it was trying to get everything done, and yet how efficient women are at getting everything done, just not always in the sort of 9 to 5 time zone that corporate America demands of them. So I do think it's probably easier physically now to manage work and a family. I'm not saying it's easy, but I'm also not saying, I'm also, you know, not of the school that it's so hard that you shouldn't try. Anything that's worth doing is worth working hard at and trying. And I just don't want people to miss out on the opportunity of having kids. And from 1 in 10 to 1 in 5 is an enormous leap. And of course, you know, Japan and Italy are wrestling with this. You're quite right to point out about South Korea. And it's where people have real choice. But I worry we're just not talking about the great fun of having a family and the great fun of having kids. It keeps you young, it keeps you engaged, and work is not enough to sustain people. And in the capitalist framework of America, we have created this narrative, especially for women, that somehow it is enough. And even the framework, which I know, you know, Helen Gurley Brown, my predecessor, Cosmopolitan, came up with, you know, have it all. Why should having work and a family be considered all? This is not a new observation, but men don't think of it in those terms. And it shouldn't be either or. We should be able to accommodate both. And I do think post-COVID, we will be able to do that in a better way.
I want to give there's some people in the audience who are sharing this idea that women feel more empowered now to say that they don't want children in the past, whereas in the past there was more pressure to say they did. I want to do a bit of a lightning round of some of the reasons that people push back, or people might be afraid to have, to use a different verb, be actually fearful of having children. So in this group, we surveyed a bunch of you before you came in today, and the number one reason was, I haven't found the right partner. I think a quarter.
Right, which is hugely important, right? Hugely important.
And it's the number one reason that women undergo the very expensive process of egg freezing. 11% said it's career. In heterosexual relationships, we have this, history built in from Disney films, et cetera, that the man should out-earn us, professionally outpower us. Do you think that has to be the case, or women can date, men who women in heterosexual relationships can date men who, don't out-earn us?
I think if you're choosing your partner on how much they earn, then it's not going to last very long, because what happens if they're earning a lot and then they're tossed out of their job? I think you want to date people that you're attracted to, that you like, that you have something in common with, that make you laugh, and that you want to be nice to, and they want to be nice to you back. So I'm not sure that that's entirely the right framework, actually, to think about a relationship. I mean, usually, hopefully chemistry is involved. And you want someone that you think is going to be responsible and competent to help in the raising of your children. I mean, I had a fantastically supportive husband, and we were married for 20 odd years. We were together for 28 years. We separated 4 years ago. We're still fantastically good friends. That, to me, is a huge achievement.
Do you have any advice for women who, for whatever reason, if they're unable to find a partner, happily single, divorced, widowed, that want to have children still? Or do you have thoughts on having, or, looking around at your own kind of friends who've done this? Maybe.
Well, I think it's really complicated going into a relationship at the beginning, when if you're really adamant when you want kids. It's a lot of pressure to put on someone else before the relationship has had a chance to really get up and running. I have not lots, but I have several friends who've had children on their own and have met people subsequently. And obviously I know lots of friends who've, inherited stepkids, and that's got its own complexities, but, mostly they've been able to figure it out. So I think there's no particular way that a family should look. And you have to figure out what works for you, but choosing someone around how much they earn is never going to. It's never going to be a great. It's never going to be a great pillar.
Yeah, that was an intentionally, I think, polarizing question. But the idea.
It's a great question. It's a great question.
But it's also debunking the myth, right? I think, and I remember reading a Times op-ed way back when about how every couple should have joint custody of their children. The argument was that women take on socially the enormous burden of childcare, or a lot of unpaid work in childcare. And I've heard young mothers, friends of mine, joke about the need for prepartum agreements, where you kind of divide up the work and or pay for the work that the woman is doing. And what's your reaction to that? And could you see that being something, as someone who's covered the culture for so long, something that could evolve and be enforceable?
One of the things I do tell young women when they tell me they're getting engaged or they're getting married is to ask whether or not they've got a prenup. I do think prenups are incredibly helpful when you go through the very traumatic process of getting a divorce. And the last thing you want to fight about when you're both emotionally in distress is money. And having something set up in advance is, I think, usually very protective to both partners, assuming it's a decent prenup and both parties bring a lawyer to it. I think bringing up children with a partner is all about really good communication, and it doesn't matter how many things you sign. Some people are going to want joint custody. Some people, it's just not going to be practical. But it's a lot about communication and about sharing and about telling people when it's not working for you. And I think women find it very difficult to do that. And and sort of, you know, taking it step by step, because the thing you learn with having a family is there is very little equilibrium. Just as you hit a point of equilibrium, you know, your children change, they go into a different phase, or one of you loses your job, or one of you gets another job, or one of you's offered a job in a different state, and you have to sort of organize that. The practicalities of bringing up a family are really intense. And then there's the financial practicality of it too.
Right.
So I think these are conversations we just have to encourage people to keep having, and we ought to have as a culture in a bigger way. And I keep coming back to the post-COVID. COVID was a terrible time, but if there was one thing that has come out of it, I do think it's the ability for people to talk a little bit more about the flexibility they need to do everything that's required of them.
Right. I think it has been this important pause for us to also reframe this idea of ambition and life and what you got out of it. And I think these conversations that we're having around work culture have greater legs now after the pandemic in some way than they had before.
Yeah.
Yeah. There's, you know, a lot of times, and I'm going to ask a question to the audience now of when I'm curious if there's a time in your own career where you felt your career ambition and your life ambitions were in conflict. And if you could share your experience in the chat or in the community feed at fairygodboss.com, that would be great. I want to end with this idea.
I have
yes, you have one. I was going to ask you. Yeah.
Well, I do have one of those moments, which was when I moved to America. I moved first for The Guardian to be their bureau chief, then I moved to the Times of London, and then I moved to New York Magazine because I didn't want to go back to London, and I realized I needed to move into the American market. And I took a 50% pay cut, and I stopped being a writer, which I had been, really because I had a job which meant I could travel around America writing. But by the time I had my second son, it really became clear to me I couldn't do that. And I was going to have to take an editing job, which meant I would be stuck behind a desk. And I struggled with that for 3 years. It was really hard. The payoff was totally worth it because I ended up going in a different direction than I would have done had I stayed as a full-time writer. But I found it really hard. And taking the 50% pay cut, because I had been on a foreign correspondence package, which was very generous, and our entire life was paid for, and there was a salary, was really hard. And I instinctively knew it was the right thing to do. I knew that the American market was was bigger than the British market, and that I could see a way where I could, you know, hopefully end up editing a magazine if I took the editing track. But it very much felt like a backward step, or it felt like 2 steps back to what I hope would eventually be 3 steps forward. And I think there are moments in your career when you end up having to do that. And the previous conversation was about people changing careers. And sometimes that means you have to do a sideways move, or you have to take a big cut in income. And it was super hard doing that. And I didn't love going into editing. It took me some time to get used to it, but then I did, and then it was fine.
Yeah. And then it became a fantastic career path for you. But
yeah, it turned out to be really fun.
Exactly. I've had those moments too. And I remember after graduate school, being 27 or 28 and thinking, I have to marry this guy I'm with because I'm about to turn 30 soon. And so I went through this path of inertia. I stayed in a relationship that I didn't think was necessarily the right relationship for me. Moved in with him, lived in a city I didn't want to stay in, San Francisco, turned my career towards from politics towards media, because that's what the opportunities were that were adjacent in some way there. And it took me a while to figure out I didn't need to stay in that relationship. It took me a long while to come out of it. And I ended up freezing my eggs and, a lot of things that probably weren't options, 15 years prior to that, 10 years prior to that. But it took me a long time to come out of that and I'd done what I think, putting my personal ambitions ahead of my career. And more recently, I've done the opposite. I've said, okay, I've had a partner who wanted me to move. And I realized that I couldn't have the same career there that I would have here. And, I think part of it has been this idea of an abundance mindset, that at some point we can not have it all, but realize our ambitions that are broader than career or personal life. And knowing that in the vast trajectory of a life, resentment or regret is not the thing I want to have material-wise, if that makes any sense.
Where were you being asked to move to?
It was very, it was more that we had started dating in New York and we're planning to stay in New York. And at some point in the relationship, he said, well, I really want to be in Toronto to be closer to family. And so it was two things. It wasn't just the city. It was more the idea of a city that probably wasn't going to be the same trajectory for me career-wise, but also that rapid change and the idea of a built-in life that comes with somebody's decades of experience living in a city versus like, I would be happy, I've lived everywhere and I'd be happy to move anywhere, but there's something about starting at an even platform versus kind of inheriting someone's life that was scary to me at the time.
Very interesting. And I think one has to have, the hardest thing in life is having really honest conversations with oneself. And, sometimes you can't always do that with a best friend because the best friend is invested in you staying in the status quo, or the best friend, has a different opinion about your life. And so sometimes it's helpful to discuss it with a therapist, or it's helpful to write it down. I find things, and I always say this whenever I give talks, but there's something incredibly helpful about keeping a journal because you're really keeping data on yourself. And then you can go back and see the patterns of your energy and see who stimulates you, what's working, what's not. And sometimes you need people to push you too. I mean, I certainly remember Peter, the father of my two children, at one point just saying to me, you've been in this job too long. You really need to get out. And he was absolutely right. So it's very helpful having people push you to move to different things.
100%. I think this has been a fantastic conversation. I'm just reading through some of the comments here in the chat.
I can't see any of the comments, so I've got.
We'll share them with you.
I'm terrified that we're not being stimulating enough for people.
No, people are very engaged, I have to say. There's someone just wondering, someone saying, I hate to admit, I wonder where I'd be now if I didn't have children. I feel ashamed for having those thoughts. Other people saying it's freeing to think that we have a choice. And I think this question, just reframing, reowning ambition as a concept that is not just specific to career, but is about how we shape our lives is really important. I want to say thank you to Joanna for being so honest and sharing your thoughts here today. And thank you to Catherine for introducing us, and to the Fairy God Boss community, the Muse community, and to each of you for sharing your thoughts in the chat, which Joanna can't read, but it's fantastic.
Can I respond to the person who said she feels guilty about wondering where she would be now? Because I'm assuming the implication is, would she be further along in her career if she didn't have her kids? First of all, don't feel embarrassed thinking that. And secondly, it's exhausting having children, partly because of the way everything is set up for us. And all I can say is, having had them and having had moments, I look back on photos of myself when my kids were little and I don't recognize myself. I look so tired and my hair is sort of all over, and I just never, ever had any time for myself. So all I would say is it does get better, and your career, if you feel it's taken a hit, and obviously there are off ramps for people and it's very difficult in some careers to get back on, and there's definitely an earning gap. It does get better. It does get better. And, hopefully your children are worth it when you walk in at the end of the day and they're a great level set for all the bullshit problems you'd be dealing with at work.
Yes. And everybody in the community, it's very lovely to see this community, because when this person said this, a number of people chimed in to say no shame and responded to
Absolutely.
that. No shame.
Yeah, you just want to make your decisions honestly, that's all. And you don't want to be caught up in the meta noise that this is too difficult to do, or that you have to do it perfectly. You don't.
100% true. Catherine, back to you.
Amazing. Thank you both so much. I really appreciate the honesty and the courage. This is not an easy topic. And I think that it's so powerful to hear personal stories, personal opinions, and all of this insight. So I want to thank both of you, Joanna and Nayeema, for the conversation today. To everyone in the audience, we are heading into a coffee break. So we have about 15 minutes. You can run to the bathroom, go get a beverage, take a little bit of time to reset, we will be back at, I believe, noon on the dot for a panel discussion on allyship in the workplace. There have been so many incredible comments in the chat. I think there's a discussion going on the Fairy God Boss website around this question of life ambitions, career ambitions, all of the different ways that people build families and communities and friendships to support them. And I love the reminder that while we're here to talk about a lot of things that are career and work related, it's not the only thing that matters. And we wanted to make sure that today's conversation was really holistic. So thank you again. And we will see everyone at noon in, I guess, about 13 minutes.